Well, let's take a look now at this beautiful 5,000-mile 1973 Coupe Deville. 1973 was a few years into this particular body style that lasted from 1971 to 1976. And the Coupe Deville was not quite the longest Cadillac. The Devilles rode atop a 130-inch wheelbase along with the Calais. The longest Cadillacs would ride atop a 133-inch wheelbase. Those would be the Fleetwood Bromes, and I'm excluding the Fleetwood 75 limousine from these stats. Now, in comparison, a full-size Chevy Caprice rode atop a 121.5-inch wheelbase, so you did get more car as you paid more money. So, yes, if you got a more expensive car, you got a longer wheelbase. Well, at least until the Cadillac Seville was introduced in 1976. But 1973 was, I think, a pretty decent year for the looks on the Cadillac. The 74s aren't my favorite, but I do like this last year with the relatively small bumper out back, although it does have some rub strips as well as some impact areas, which we'll talk about in a second. And, of course, you've got the thicker front bumper here because of the 5-mile-an-hour impact standard up front. Now, 1973, the front end was revised slightly versus the 1972 model, but it was relatively similar. You can see here you have that typical Cadillac Power Dome style hood that was a trademark for many years, and perhaps it was most prominently started on the 1967 Eldorado, and it kind of trickled on through the Cadillac lineup. By the way, one thing I always found interesting about these Cadillacs is that Cadillac really never had a trapped hood design during this period. In other words, the hood extended all the way to the front of the vehicle, and you can see it kind of curls over just over top of the headlamps and turn signals. This meant that the manufacturers didn't have to worry about the hood mating up to a front surface. Other General Motors vehicles during this time frame had that so-called trapped hood, and then you had to worry about the hood aligning on that front edge as well as the left and the right-hand side. Now, I will say that by 1973, Cadillac quality was starting to get a little bit better, and the 1971 and 72 quality, I think, is just absolutely abysmal. Notice, actually, that the gap on the driver's side, the hood defender, is pretty gosh darn tight all the way back, and as you'll see on this car, it's true for the passenger side, too. So Cadillac was actually doing a halfway decent job, I would say, during this time frame of quality, and had pulled themselves out of the doldrums in the 1971-72 model years. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we come to the interior. Now, it is interesting to me that they never had that trapped hood design, but notice the bumper here is a multi-piece bumper, and I think that's because they wanted this sharp right angle to go around the corner, and that was probably a little bit hard for that to be formed in one piece, especially given the length of that part that runs down alongside the fender. And here you can see the passenger side. Notice that hood gap is also very tight on the passenger side. Again, shockingly tight for this era of vehicle. You can see the large cornering light there ahead of the wheel. Cadillac would introduce cornering lights to the motoring public for the first time in 1962. Cadillac was actually the innovator for that. And you can see, again, that multi-piece bumper. Now take a look at the front, and you notice that there's the Cadillac crest, and there's a V underneath it. The DeVilles would get the V, the Fleetwood cars would get the wreath, and then the Calais in some model years would get neither. So depending upon which Cadillac you had, that kind of determined if you had no wreath, you had a V, you had nothing, well, you get the picture. Now from this angle, you really get a sense of the overall length of this car. It is just massive, the 227, 228 inches, and look at that quarter panel, how long that is. I love that spear motif, that kind of torpedo motif on the quarter panel. I always thought that was pretty cool on these cars. Now, the 73s do have this interesting feature. First of all, take a look at the bumpers, and you can see the rub strip on the bottom portion of the vertical tail lamps, as well as obviously in the bumper itself. That was for the 2.5-mile-an-hour impact standard in the rear for 1973. But on top of that, you have this little extension, this mini fender extension, between the quarter panel and the bumper. And that is the smallest fender extension that Cadillac had during this time frame. In 1974, they would start going to these huge fender extensions as the rear impact standard would be increased to 5 miles per hour. Now, I have to say the styling on these is rather clean, and there's not all that many feature lines. There's just some very subtle features like that torpedo And then the body side has this nice curvature. Of course, there's a ton of tumble home. Look at how curved that side glass is and how narrow the roof panel is compared to the midsection of the body. But overall, even the deck lid on this isn't all that complicated. These were not complicated stampings on this particular Cadillac. I guess Cadillac was going for a little bit of simplicity with this 1973 model year. And here we have a view of the driver's side. Again, that long quarter panel with the fender extension. Again, just a very large car. They certainly don't make two-door cars this long anymore, unfortunately. I think everybody's gone to trucks now because they really just want a big car like this. Well, and they also want to sit up high. But trucks are basically the modern-day equivalent of these huge luxury barges. But I have to say, that, as you're going to see in a second, that these old vehicles have quite a bit more space on them than the interiors of today's trucks, which have these very large center consoles. This has, as you could guess, a bench seat. Let's take a look inside now. And here we have a look inside this beautiful Cadillac. I love the stunning black leather seats, the black interior. And this car has quite a few options, from the floor mats to the leather seating areas, to the tilt telescoping wheel, the automatic climate control, the AM/FM stereo radio. So, well, Cadillac still had quite a few options back then, even though they were Cadillacs, especially if you got a Calais. But this was a DeVille. And this was the last year for this instrument panel. In 1974, it would be revised. This instrument panel would be around from 1971 to 73. And all the GM cars of this era, the full-size cars, had this wraparound instrument panel except the Chevrolet. But Cadillac had it just like the other divisions did. Now, one little piece of trivia for you, the door panels on these are secured with these very large buttons, I guess, for 1973, after, I guess, Cadillac learned in 1971 and 72 that the way that they had the door straps secured to the door panel was just totally inadequate. The straps would pull out from their mountings, and the dealer fix was to actually drill holes in escutcheons that covered the attachment points for the door pull straps. In other words, it was just a lousy setup. These door pull straps were much briefer than the 1971 to 72 models, and they didn't have nearly the problems that those previous models did. Now let's take a look at the back seat here. A rather comfy place to be. Again, this black leather just looks rich, probably because it's a 5,000-mile car. And you have not really a wraparound seat, but an overall cozy cabin. This was starting to get into the waning years of the Cadillac high-back seats that they had. And you can see that this seat is very tall, especially by 1973 standards. A lot of seats from this era really didn't come up more than to your shoulder height. But these seats went all the way up, and Cadillac did that for safety starting in the late 1960s. And I think people ended up just disliking it, so they reverted back to a more normal seat shortly after this car was produced. And here we have the mighty Cadillac 472 cubic inch V8 under hood. The 472 was introduced in the 1968 model year. Back then, it was a premium fuel V8. From 1971 forward, it was a regular no-lead fuel V8 due to the lowered compression ratio. That was done largely for emissions reasons. By 1973, it was making 220 horsepower from 472 cubic inches, or 7.7 liters, which sounds crazy. It did make 365 pound-feet of torque. And in general, I would say that when you stomp on the accelerator in these cars, they're not slow. They're certainly not fast. I mean, they're big cars, but you don't really, let's say, crave a bunch more power. The 472 is a really, really nice V8, smooth and relatively powerful. I will say that you can get a few extra ponies out of these V8s by putting dual exhausts on them. They came standard with just single exhaust from the factory with a resonator. So if you put dual exhausts on it, you could probably get about another 20, 25 horsepower. Now, if you take a look, this is a federal emissions certified car, but it does have an air pump. You can see the air pipe there near the alternator. And for whatever reason, Cadillac, I guess, just couldn't get its V8 in standard form to meet the emission standards of the day without that air pump, which was kind of funny because it just injected air and diluted the exhaust gases in the exhaust stream. It did admittedly help them burn a bit better, but I just thought that that was an interesting solution to try to meet emission standards, which I believe at the time were based on particles per million. So if you inject more air into the exhaust, well, you're just injecting more clean particles, and that certainly helps you. And I will say that if you've driven one of these cars, the part throttle tip-in, they don't feel as torquey as other General Motors V8s of the era. Cadillac V8s, even in my 1969 Eldorado, it's not that it's, let's say, lagging when you first step on it, but it doesn't have quite the torquey response that you'd expect from such a V8, and you really got to stomp on the accelerator. It's almost like a binary throttle. Then it comes alive after you get into the secondaries on the Quadrajet. I will say that if you want the initial part throttle tip-in to be more responsive, just replace the primary metering rods in your Quadrajet with ones that are 2,000 or 3,000 smaller. That'll richen the mixture a little bit, and you'll get a lot better throttle response. These are just jetted lean. I've done that on my Cadillacs of this era, and it really, really wakes them up. You can also, if you want, you can richen up the secondary metering rods to get a little bit more power. I think that those even were still a little lean, but the main part throttle tip-in, the part throttle tip-in is all related to the primary metering rods and jets, so you can mess around with those in your spare time on your Quadrajet carburetor. And you can see here that the Cadillac V8s had that air conditioning compressor in the middle of the V that helped minimize vibrations. I think Cadillac just assumed the air conditioning compressor was running most of the time on a lot of these cars that had air conditioning because it had automatic climate control. The AC would then run basically anytime it was above freezing outside, and you had the climate control in the auto setting. So they wanted to minimize the overall vibration, and they put the air conditioning compressor right in the middle as you see it here. These also seem to have one of the longest radiator hoses that I know of that snakes all the way from that driver's side down past the air conditioning compressor to the thermostat housing. It was just the Cadillac design overall. But I do think it's cool Cadillac put this bracing in between the firewall and the fender liners, and then from the fender liners up to the front of the car too. I think they were just trying to get this body to stiffen up, which for General Motors, the 1971 to 76 bodies were not overly stiff. And you couldn't do what Cadillac did here on the Oldsmobile because the Oldsmobile had plastic fender liners, but Cadillac had metal fender liners, so they could be structural components to help with the overall rigidity. And last but not least, I'll just show you a picture of the trunk on this car, and the trunk is cavernous, absolutely cavernous. It's huge. I had one of these Cadillacs. I had a 72 sedan DeVille, and I remember one day that a pen flew out of my backpack and it rolled toward that spare tire there. I could not retrieve the pen standing outside of the car, either from the side because the fins were so high, or from the back because it was just too long of a distance. I had to climb in the trunk to retrieve the pen to get it out. That's how big these particular Cadillacs were. So just a lot of space and a lot of car, and I think a good-looking car. What do you think? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.